Good afternoon and welcome to CAD-1 and BD Mackey's joint Revit structural reinforcing webinar. Today I have Brian Mackey, owner and president of BD Mackey Consulting, one of the really great Revit and BIM consulting firms here in the country, and we're always honored to have Brian do these webinars for us. My name, of course, is Stan Henne. I'm the business development manager here at CAD-1. So. Brian, do we have any preliminary slides, or are you just going to jump right in today? Here?
We'll jump a little bit into this. So obviously our go-to-meeting slide.
So we have the minimize console, so you can see the whole screen, and the raise your hand button, so you can listen to either telephone or mic and speakers. You can switch back and forth. And probably the most important one is the questions box. That's where you can type in your questions, and we'll try and answer them as closely in context as we can. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started.
And again, on the question, just make sure if we're at a point where you want to ask a question, ask that question, because I don't want to have to come back and try to answer the question, and maybe we've changed the model or file too far to where it's going to be difficult to answer. So if any question comes up, feel free to answer it.
Feel free to ask it, yeah.
So we're into Revit structural reinforcing. A lot of people, especially possibly architects or engineers, have had this tool, maybe not have been using it for a while. So we're going to get into just doing rebar and rebar sets. We'll talk about area and path reinforcement and get into the fabric. We're also going to jump into some of the reinforcement settings. So it's not like it's a whole lot of craziness that we're going to be getting into. More of it's going to be some of the basic stuff we're getting into, and a lot of the trials and tribulations you might have when you start getting into that.
Now, Brian, let me ask you, because that's a good question. There are people out there who have Revit architecture, 12 or 13. The reinforcing is not built into the plain vanilla Revit architecture, is it?
That is true. Revit architecture does not have reinforcing, but if you're on one of the building design suites, yes, you will have Revit, which will on the structure tab have the reinforcing.
So just wanted to make that clear to everybody.
Obviously, if you're in Revit structure, you do have the reinforcing in any release. And the same thing for Revit MEP is true. You don't have reinforcing in Revit MEP either. So that said, we'll just go ahead and jump into the Revit world. So I did start this very simple little project. Yeah, as you can see, it's extremely simple. Just using the native Revit template. So there's no bells or whistles here. I just grabbed what's loaded in the Revit template. So I created some walls, some beams, some floors. I also went through and created some sloping beams and a warping floor, so we can really get in there and start talking about that.
Brian's just getting over a cold today, so if he's coughing a little bit, cut him a little slack there.
So you're going to jump right into this, and just going to go down to my level 1 view to really start talking about the reinforcing. Now on your structure panel, you will see that we do have the reinforcement panel. So that reinforcement panel is going to allow us to choose what type of reinforcement we're going to do. It's also got the drop down, which will allow us to get into our 2 settings, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but the rebar cover settings and the reinforcement settings. The other thing I want to talk about when you start dealing with that is as you simply grab a family, you'll also notice that in the contextual ribbon, you're going to get the reinforcement tab come up as well. So it's very similar to the other reinforcement tab, except for this is element specific. And what I mean by that, you'll notice that if I grab a structural column, the only type of rebar I get is 3D rebar. But if I grab a wall or a floor, I'm going to get rebar, area, path, and fabric. So if you do it through the contextual ribbon, it's going to truly allow you to see what type of rebar can be placed in this object and what type of rebar can't. The other thing that you might get, depending on how the families were created, I know I've seen some add-on families to Revit, or add-on programs that do create families, etc. And some of those add-on families, they actually have settings wrong in there. So you might actually go grab something like a structural connection or other things, and it can come up saying it's allowing you to have rebar inside of that object. I do want to talk about that and why that setting is, because I've seen a lot of people creating families since 2012 Revit, and they didn't understand that this feature was in there. So if you go to start a new family, I'm just going to do a new family, and I'm going to go just grab the generic model template. So I'm just going to go start with a basic generic model. Now one of the things you're going to see over here in your properties, it's not generic model, sorry, structural connections. I'm going to go make this a structural connection family, not generic model. So one of the things when you start grabbing certain families inside of there is it actually gives you the availability to go into its types and say it allows for, trying to find it in here, maybe I'm in the wrong kind of family, I'm forgetting where it is. but it allows for you to have rebar set in there. I thought it was just a checkbox in here. I'm trying to find it. Show family precut, Omni. Do I have to change the material to concrete first? I don't think so. Maybe that's got fixed in one of the updates, but I know there was one of them in there. I'll probably think of it here in a little bit. That in your family, there's a checkbox that says allows reinforcing. So when you start going and creating some of these families, if you want it to be able to be reinforced, you can check the allows reinforcing, or you can uncheck that depending if you don't want to. So like slab edges can allow for reinforcing, they don't have to. And there's some other families, and I just drew a mind blank on what that family is going to be, that will allow you to have that property as well. So just want to put that out there. If you start grabbing something, man, this really shouldn't allow for reinforcing, it's just simply because that's checked in the family type properties. So wanted to point that out. So we're just going to start off doing something very simple. I'm going to grab this little structural column, and we're going to start off placing, reinforcing this column. The one thing I did want to point out, that you have to be sectioning through an object before Revit will allow you to place reinforcing in it. So if, I should say rebar, not necessarily all reinforcing. If I grab this column here and I hit the rebar and I go start placing this in my structural footing, you can see it's not going to let me place this in that structural footing because I'm not sectioning through the object. So it will allow you to place rebar inside of objects you're sectioning through for the 3D rebar. Path and area reinforcement, you don't have to be sectioning through the object, nor do you with the fabric reinforcing either. So if you're looking at just the 3D rebar command, you have to be sectioning through that object. You will notice, though, that when I did grab the structural foundation and go say I was going to place rebar in there, even though I was grabbing a structural foundation, you'll see that it'll let me put rebar in the walls, it'll let me put rebar in the column. So it's not like you have to be in the right element and select it, and it's only going to let you put rebar in the selected element. It'll let you put rebar in any element that is available in the view you're in. So when we come down here and start looking at replacing rebar, once you grab that rebar command, it's a pretty big deal to pay attention to what's happening in your contextual ribbon, because you've got the availability to place rebar parallel to the work plane you're in, parallel to the cover you may be in, or possibly perpendicular. So I'm going to switch rebar types here real quick. And you're going to see that if I say parallel to work plane, I'm just putting this one flat dowel in here. But if I go ahead and say I'm going to go perpendicular to work plane, now I'm basically putting the vertical dowel in. So depending on if you're parallel or perpendicular is what's going to allow you to set this inside of here. You're also going to see that you have the availability to choose layout rules for the rebar. You can put a single piece of rebar in there. You can go and say, I'm going to do a fixed number of rebar pieces. I want 6, I want 12, whatever you're going to do. And there's some different rules you're dealing with inside of there. Again, we'll cover all this here in a little bit. And then the big thing that I think most people miss when they're starting to place rebar is you can choose what rebar size you want to be dealing with. So you got to kind of be all over the place here. Gee, what am I doing with my rebar layout rules, etc.? What am I doing with the rebar size itself? So you're kind of doing this in the rebar, in the contextual ribbon. You're also paying attention to what's going on in the properties. For those of you who haven't seen this yet, you also have then what's called Shape Browser. So you're also then in the Shape Browser going to be coming in here and choosing what shape of rebar you're going to be dealing with. So they've got all these set up per Steelbook, talking about all the different rebar shapes. So if you're really familiar with the Steelbook, you'll understand all the shapes. I'm not one of those people, so I usually have to see the pretty pictures. The one thing I always like to point out about the Shape Browser is if you accidentally close the Shape Browser, you're kind of like, help? How do I get it back? And it's not like everything else in Revit where you go to the User Interface tab to bring it back. You're like, there's no Shape Browser in here. How do I get this back? Where you will see this is in the fact when you get to the status bar. So the status bar, the options bar, not the status bar. When you start coming through here to look at this, you're going to see you've got this Browse button. And all this little Browse button does is open and close the Rebar Shape Browser. So if you accidentally close it and you're like, oh, how do I get this open? It's just a simple little Browse button here. If you are one of those people who know all your rebar shapes accordingly, you can close that for screen real estate, and you'll see you can also grab the same rebar shapes off of the drop-down list in the options bar. So depending on if you need the browser or if you just want to do it through the drop-down list. Again, I'm one of those people that's going to have to do it through the drop-down list, or the browser, excuse me. So I'm going to come down here and scroll, and I'm just going to go grab my rebar shape T1. And I'm just going to start to place this T1 inside of here. And if you go to think that, oh, gee, I'm putting the stirrup inside of here. Wait, what's going on? This is kind of vertical. It's because I have perpendicular set as opposed to parallel. Once I change that to parallel, now I can start coming in and deciding, hey, maybe I want to put that in this column. I could even put this all the way across this wall, etc., depending on where you're placing it. You'll also see, depending on which cover distance you get to, it will set that up and rotate it. A little fact that a lot of people don't know is you can also use the space bar to rotate where the bends are going to be located in that column family as well, or whatever you're placing it in. So you can move the mouse where you want it to be close to the object, or you can then choose to use the space bar. You might also see a weird scenario where if I get to here, it's kind of like, wait, what the heck is going on? Why is all of a sudden, if I'm slightly outside of my rebar cover, is this deciding to go all the way across the screen? Well, that's because I have a structural column above, and it's understanding that, oh, above this, you could be possibly placing it in a structural column. You'll see the same thing going off to the side. I've got a structural column going that direction, so my rebar will allow me to go that way as well. So I'm just going to come in here, not a big deal. I'm going to place this one piece of rebar. I'm going to go into my 3D view where I can actually have it in wireframe, where I've actually somewhat made these objects transparent. And you can see inside of here, oh, wait a second, where is this rebar going to go? Maybe I'll go into wireframe, and now you can see there's my piece of rebar. Okay, so I've set that up. I went through. I've got my piece of rebar here. It's going to be placed directly where the section you created was, or at the level you were in is placed. So I'll put this right at level 1 since that's the view I was in. You'll see later when I cross this in a section, it'll put it in where that section is. If you forgot to change your layout rule, the nice part about this is you can come back after the fact and you can come in and choose to change your layout rule. You know, I really didn't want a single rebar. Maybe I wanted to do a fixed number of rebars and I wanted to do 12 of these rebars. So just give me 12. Once I change that to a fixed number, it's going to just go through and give me those rebars, and it's going to stretch it through the entire object to where the rebar cover settings are. So this is taking the rebar all the way up this column, probably down 3/4 of an inch from the top. I think that's what my rebar cover is, all the way down to 3/4 of an inch from the bottom. So you have the capability to play with the different rebar numbers. You know, in this case, I might have wanted to say, gee, I want to do a fixed number, but I want to give myself the spacing. So maybe I only want to go through and give myself 6 pieces of rebar, and I need those to be 6 inches apart. So just by changing that value, it's going to adjust it from its bottom and go through and take that object up and down. So many different things you can start doing to play with that rebar. You can get it set up. You can go through. You can see what's going on inside of here. The other thing that a lot of times I'll start doing is I'll go back to the floor plan. I like to do a lot of my rebar in sections to see what's going on. So a lot of times I'll cut a section through the object I'm placing rebar in. So I'll go move my little building section I have here in there, and now I can really start to see, okay, here's the rebar I'm putting in, and it's a little bit easier than a 3D view to start seeing what you're doing and what's going on with that.
Here's a question from Gina. Brian, is there a way to graphically show rebar in section larger than it actually is for it to appear on the documents clearly, but not change the actual size of the rebar as not to incorrectly quantify the schedule?
If you're placing a single dowel, that might be possible, but for doing the stirrups and stuff, I'm not sure if it would be. I'm trying to think of, no, I don't think it is. Sorry. I was thinking to be able to do like a coarse, medium, fine level of detail and change the way it looks, but the way the rebar families are, it's just basically you're drawing a path, and there's pre-built rules into it for the size to represent what it is. So I don't believe it'd be possible to do that, not even on a single dowel. So, unfortunately. So one nice thing about rebar that as you've done this and set this up is you're going to notice that all of your objects have these green dashed lines. Those green dashed lines are your cover settings. If I were to just grab the structural column, you're going to see that in all of your elements, you've got rebar cover, top face possibly, bottom face, and other faces. So you can come in here and start to see what's going on with my rebar cover settings. So I can come in here for the other faces, in this case that would be all the sides of my column, and say, gee, I really wanted that to be a 3-inch rebar spacing. So I can come in, or 3-inch clear spacing. And you'll notice that once I grab that rebar and it adjusts the cover, it adjusted with it. Again, if I go back and grab that column and say, no, 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 what are you thinking? That should have just been 1.5 inches. Again, that rebar is going to adjust to what those cover settings are. When you go into those cover settings, it's kind of weird the way it's set up or named possibly. I know a lot of people don't necessarily like the way this is named. These cover settings and the way those names are being called are all going to be set up in your rebar cover settings. So again, I'm out of the box template. If I come down here and say rebar cover settings, there's the different types that we had inside of there. If I grab this one, I could just simply click there and I can just say, you know, this is exterior, cast against earth. Whatever I wanted to do, I can start changing these values. So a lot of people don't really even go for what the rhyme or reason is. Hey, I just want to call this 1.5 inches, 3 inches, 5 inches, and you can just go through and set that up for what you needed it to be. If you also wanted to create a new rebar cover setting, gee, for some other reason I needed a 1 inch or a 1/2 inch or something that's not inside of here, all you have to do is just hit duplicate, give it a name of what you want it to be, and then simply change the value for what you want that cover settings to be. So you're just going through into rebar cover settings, and this will allow you to create as many different styles or distances as you want, and then rename them accordingly. I know a lot of people have issues with the exterior cast against earth type scenarios. And once you see that I've changed that, now when I come in here to look at this, I've got my beautiful new 1 inch setting to allow me to change the rebar cover to that setting. You're also going to notice that occasionally one of your rebar cover settings is grayed out. So when I come in here, it's like, why can't I adjust the rebar cover on the top face? Well, the reason for that might be is it's actually attached to a floor. So this column has been attached to a floor. It's joined to the floor. So when I start looking at rebar, the rebar is going to give me the cover all the way up to what the floor setting was going to be, not independent of that object. If I were to come in here and just delete this floor out of here, and then select my column, my rebar top face is no longer grayed out. So it grays it out if it's being joined with another object, so you don't go through and try to connect other things to it. Okay? So the other thing you might have on that is that's great. I'm going to do this from a 3D view here real quick, and I'm just going to grab my column. I'm going to isolate this with my sunglasses, and I'm going to get out a wireframe. That I might want to come inside of here, and maybe I need this one side to be different than the rest of them, right? Because this only gave us top, bottom, and other faces. If you need to start changing the different covers, you're going to notice that in your in your reinforcement panel, there's this actual cover button. So if I come up here and click the cover button, I can tell it to do the cover on the element, which is basically just going to give me the same properties that I have for the properties of it. But if I want to, I can go back and give myself the cover for individual faces. So now when I come here and say individual faces, I can pick on a face of the column. Well, I guess I picked the back face. And then I can see what that column is set up to. Oh, on this face, it's supposed to be 1 inch. Maybe on that one individual face, I needed it at 3 inches. Then maybe on this face over here, I'm going to need that at 1.5 inches. So you can start to go through with your cover settings and adjusting each face of each member independently. And of course, if I've already got the reinforcing in there, as I change the one side to 3 and the other side to 1.5 inches or whatever I changed it to, it's going to go through and update those settings. One of the downsides of that is once you change it, it says other faces is none, and it does confuse a lot of people. So if you've ever grabbed an object and wondered, why is my cover saying none but the rebar snapping to it, and when I grab the rebar I can clearly see cover settings on there, that's all because of the individual face segment. I wish it would say varies as opposed to none, but it is coming here and going to say, hey, none if it varies. Again, if you go back and change it, then you're breaking that for the individual faces you've changed and putting it in for all faces. Those cover settings are true for everything. Walls, floors, columns, beams. Those cover settings are going to be there for everything, and that's what's going to be your settings to go through and adjust those. So let's talk about placing rebar in something where I might have modeled a structural column next to a wall to represent a pilaster. If I come down here and grab the rebar tool, and again I'm going to go grab the T1, I always want to talk to people that it depends on where you're trying to place this. It's giving me I can't create this rebar here because it's looking at this column in just this 6-inch space or whatever distance that is, and it's starting to say I can't create it in that narrow of a space. If I were to maybe go change the rebar size, now it's still too narrow, change the column size to be larger, it would probably let me do it. So a lot of times it just depends on where you hover. If I now come hover over to the right side of that face as opposed to the left side of the wall's rebar cover, it's then going to allow me to say, hey, this is where I'm going to place this. In a scenario like this, the space bar doesn't change where you're going to be putting the bins if that's a big deal to you, but you can always put that rebar in, come back after the fact, select it, and use the space bar to rotate where those bins are going to be going as well. So just be aware of if the space is too small or you've got columns adjoining, you might have that issue. Okay, so let's say we now have got some of the rebar stirrups in here. We want to go put some dowels in, etc. I'm going to go grab the rebar command again, and I'm going to go switch my shape to be the rebar shape 0. And I'm going to go perpendicular to my cover. You'll notice that when I come in here and start to place this, it's not going up to the cover settings. New to 2013, it'll actually allow you to snap to the other rebar that's there. This was a big deal. In the past, you had to like put this in and then go back and use the align command. You'll even notice that it snaps to the object on the radius. So if you wanted to put one out here in the corner, you want to get it equally spaced in the corner, it's going to snap to that radius. Temporary dimensions are going to usually equal it out. You'll kind of feel that like, oh gee, I've just hit the midpoint or the quadrant or whatever you want to call it of that radius. So it does help nicely if you wanted to come through here and start placing those rebars. Again, if I wanted to show there were 3 rebars going across, as opposed to saying it's single, I want a fixed number of 3, I'm now going to have that fixed number of 3 going across there. The one thing I like to point out to people is what if you wanted the 3 going the other direction as opposed to this direction? When placing that individual rebar component, one of the things I like to tell people is if I wanted 3 going horizontal or 3 going vertical, a lot of times I'll just place it randomly over here where it needs to be, and then I'll go back and change it as opposed to trying to place it into the corner. Because if I change it now to be that fixed number of 3, these are going to be butting up next to it on the left side. So I kind of place it next to the rebar cover I want, and then it'll go through and do that. If I place a rebar again up on by this cover or this edge up here, change this one to be a rebar of 3. Now I'm fixed number. Now you'll see it's going posted that direction. So it's just really understanding which direction you want those to go and how you're going to have those set up. So pick it close to the one you're dealing with, see what's going on inside of there. Excuse me. So what's also nice about doing a lot of this, again, if I go back into this section, that I might be wanting this rebar to be heavily spaced here. So my little tip when placing rebars, you might have a heavy bottom-loaded beam or column, heavy end-loaded beam and our heavy column, bottom-loaded column. What I'll do is I'll just take that object and I'll grab my copy command and I'll take that copy command and move it up the file. Then I'll come in here and say, well, okay, now I just wanted to do a maximum spacing and I don't want that spacing to exceed 18 inches. So boom, it'll go through and it'll give me in that area 18 inches. Here's a little quirk about Revit. If I change it from like a fixed number or number and I change it to something else, I get no shape handles. I have to click off to the side to deselect it, click back on that object, and now you'll see I've got the shape handles to allow myself to stretch the distance. So great, that one's starting kind of down there. I need this one to come up here and start at that snap distance. So now maybe I'll come down here to this one, and I really need this one down here to line up with that one because that's where I wanted the distance to happen. Now the problem by dragging that one down and lining it up here is technically I have 2 pieces of rebar on top of each other. But I still do it this way because I don't want to have to try to calculate how high this is going to be off of my map. Because what's really nice about this is if you select a rebar string, you can actually see that I have this little checkbox for hide the first bar, or at the top I'd have a checkbox for hide the last bar. So now I can use it to line these up so they're on top of each other and then simply uncheck that rebar so I no longer have overlapping rebar, but it's really helping me, my assistant, and my dealing with laying that rebar out. So I'll usually do one at the bottom, copy it up, change the value, click to the side, reselect it, stretch it where I want it to be. So it's going through, setting that all up, getting it all done. The other thing is if I wanted to go place another piece of rebar inside of here, maybe I want to show a hook going from the foundation up into that. So we'll just go grab my 17A. One of the things when you start getting inside of there, oops, wrong button, is the 17A isn't going to really allow me to necessarily go up into the file like I might be thinking, gee, I wanted this to go up into the family. Also, if I put it up here in the column, it's going to go the entire length. I'm more of a person, I'll just come down here and I'll put it in the footing, and then I can grab that object, and you can see the space bar well rotated inside of there. Not a big deal, but now I can really start coming in here and just start playing with and stretching the size of where I needed this object to be. I can also use the align command. The column should have rebar in the center. I'm going to hide this chunk of rebar so as not to confuse me. But I can go grab my align command if I wanted to. Should find the center of the column. I should be able to find either the center or the edge of this piece of rebar if you wanted it in the center. So I can, oh, it's not aligning that for me. Probably because this leg is too long and it's not liking the length of that leg. Let's try this again. Okay. Don't know why that's not aligning. It almost always lets me align. I'll have to look at that. The other thing that I like to point out about this is the fact that I'm probably going to want this stretched inside anyway. The fact that you do this and you start stretching it, what you're actually doing is changing your default values inside of the properties. So for me, a lot of times I'll come down and get this stretched close to where I think it should be, or I don't know why the align command is not working on this one. Try the move command since align's not working for me. So I'll move it over, get what I need to do, and then inside of here I can come back and say, gee, maybe I should actually make that a real number, and I'll just make that 1'4" or 1'2" because it's outside the cover distance. And then up here, this one I just wanted to make 3 feet. So you can see I can go through and play with the values after I've stretched it to give myself some better values when going through and setting this object up. You can also then do something like, hey, I want to grab that piece of rebar. You can mirror the rebar if you needed to. Get that set up. And if I go back down and look at this in a floor plan, I should be able to see those 2 pieces of rebar. And you'll see, like I said, that piece of rebar came in exactly at the section line where the section line is. So if that's not where you wanted it to be, I'm going to try this again. I'm going to go crazy and try, yeah. You can align the rebar. Oh, it wasn't working a second ago. So I can grab the center of the column and align that dowel to it if that's where I wanted it to go. I can take those and rotate them, move them around, etc. Get those all set up. So you have that capability to do that with your rebar as well. Probably flip the section so we can actually see that dowel. So I've got all my dowels in there, got that set up. Again, now I can come inside of here and choose what I wanted to do. Maybe I want to go place another piece of rebar in this column. So we'll just go up and grab, I don't know, we'll grab a shape 2, put it at the bottom. Probably should have said beforehand that I wanted to do a fixed number of 3. Now the cross section I have a fixed number of 3. So you can go through and start setting that all up. Now one of the beauties of as you put the rebar into a concrete object, these objects now will start having an estimated reinforcement volume. So you can see right now my estimated reinforcement volume is 29.1. But if I come down here and decided that, oh, these were too small, I need to change those from a number 3 bar to a number 7. As I change the bar size, it's going to change the estimated reinforcement volume. So it is picking up on the correct bar sizes to give you the volume. It is picking up on all that information. Now, the one thing I want to point out, that this volume from this rebar is being calculated by its host. The volume for the top half of this is not going to be calculated into the column or wall. I placed it in the footing, therefore the volume of this object is going into the footing value, not the column value. So when you saw me place this dowel, I see a lot of people doing these dowels and placing them in the column and stretching them down. Whichever one you want to do, that's fine. Just understand that where that volume goes is in the original host object. So if you're really starting to try to figure that out and set that up the way you want it, it's going to be adjusted per the host. So the other thing that's kind of nice about this is as you're going through and setting this information up, the one thing that I always like to point out, which is kind of cool, but kind of in my mind a bug, that when you grab a piece of rebar, you can choose what kind of hook you wanted. So right now, you'll see that if I grab this rebar, it's telling me it's a rebar shape 2. And if I wanted to take this and say, oh man, it should be a rebar shape 1, don't give me a bend here. All of a sudden what happened is this created a new rebar for you, and it's called rebar shape 1. So no longer am I using the 0-2, I'm using a piece of rebar called rebar shape 1. If I come back here and turn off this angle to be a none as well, it's smart enough to understand, oh wow, you're now really similar to a rebar shape 0, so I'm going to switch your family type out to a rebar shape 0. So there are some rules built into it, but I do like to point out that if you're coming down here going, oh, I'm going to add 90 degree to this one, well, my opinion is you shouldn't be clicking on adding the 90 degree angle to that. What you should be doing, I'm going to undo that real quick, is grabbing your shape browser and choosing to make that a rebar shape 17 or 11 or whatever you need that to be. Gee, that should be a 17A, which now has the hook. So just be aware of as you start doing that, I go to projects and I start looking down at the family types, and I go start looking at the rebar shapes, and I'll see rebar shape 1, 2, 12, 256, simply because people are turning the hooks on and off. So always like to point that out because that can become an issue. You end up with hundreds of different rebar shapes in there. So think about that. Change the bar type as opposed to necessarily doing the hooks if that's something that you were looking at doing. Okay? So now that we've talked about that, I'm going to jump into the area reinforcement and path reinforcement with rebar. I like to do this from a 3D view, so I'm just going to go back and jump into my nice little 3D view. I'm going to restore all the stuff inside of here. So I'm just going to come over here to this wall. Now, we could use those same tools on the wall to go through and start doing the reinforcement. So I could come into the wall and do horizontal rebars, do vertical rebars, give them a maximum layout rule, etc. But in 2013, what was nice is they've adapted this area reinforcement to now be three-dimensional. In the past, when you did area reinforcement, you would only see that area reinforcement when you cut a section. So if you exported it out to Navisworks or anything else, it would not display. In 2013, they changed the area and path reinforcement to truly be 3D. So I'm going to grab my area reinforcement. It's going to ask me to pick a host. I'm just going to pick this wall here. And then once I've picked that wall and what the host is, now we go draw a shape for what we want that area reinforcement to be. You can draw a rectangle. You can make the rectangle the size of the wall if you want to. Trying to find the endpoint of my wall there. You can padlock it to the wall and hope that it moves with the wall if the wall size changes. That's really the only drag part about area reinforcement is it doesn't understand the host and not always understands the cover distances either. But we'll see what happens. So once you do your sketch and your area reinforcement, you're going to notice that you've got these parallel lines similar to what you have when you're sketching a floor. Those parallel lines are going to represent the major direction of your rebar. So if I want the major to be vertical as opposed to horizontal, you're going to notice that you have major direction in the properties. You can then go pick one of the sketch lines, or if you wanted the major direction to be diagonal, you could choose to go draw a diagonal line in here, and that will become your major direction. So you can either sketch a line if you want to, or pick an existing sketch line, which is what I usually do to get that to happen. You're also going to see then you've got crazy different properties for this area reinforcement. So you've got a few of the same layout rules, maximum spacing or mixed number, or fixed number, excuse me. Then you've got, do you want bars in the major direction? Do you want major hook orientations? Do you need bars in the minor direction? Do you need interior major bars, interior minor bars? You can go through and start playing with going on with all of these. I'm going to go ahead and just say we're going to hook up towards the interior, and we're going to do a 90-degree hook at the top. I think that's at the top. We'll find out what we did there. We'll hit the finish button, and boom, now we've just put all of that reinforcing inside of there. So you can see just by going in there, dropping that area reinforcement, it basically went in and created rebar sets for me. It shows you the properties of the rebar set. It shows you what's going on, but since it's a subset of an area reinforcement, all of that information is grayed out. If you want to change any of those, you have to grab the big giant X that represents the area reinforcement, and then you change that inside the area reinforcement. So if you're like, oh, gee, those shouldn't have been number 3 bars, those should have been number 6s, you change that via the area reinforcement, not the rebar set itself. What's also cool about that is if I go into the west elevation for that wall, you'll see that I can see that area reinforcement in the west elevation. I can now come down here and choose to tag that reinforcement. So if I go to my annotate tab, there's an area reinforcement symbol. I can grab this, and then that symbol will come up and tell me what's going on with all that rebar. So it shows me the symbol that I've got a hook up here and I've got a hook down here. I'm kind of at a loss right now is why it's not actually telling me what the area is. Do I have to tag that by category? Yeah, I didn't think so. There it is. So that's your symbol, and then you can come in and place a tag to represent its number 6s at 1 foot on center each way. Goes through and sets all of that information up for you. And this is, I think, exterior. So number 6 is on the exterior, etc., etc. So you've got these nice, beautiful tags to use. You can use those in elevations, plans, sections, if you're doing it on a wall, if you're doing it on, I didn't tell the tag in here, must still be in the command. If you're doing it on a wall, if you're doing it on a floor, etc. So, but you can't do area reinforcement but walls and floors. You can't do area reinforcement on footings. You can't do area reinforcement on columns, beams. Only can be done on walls and floors. Okay? So once that information is done, you've got the path reinforcement. And I'm just going to go down to level 1, and we'll just do path reinforcement on my slab over here. So path reinforcement works very similar to the area reinforcement. Oops, I want path reinforcement. You've got to pick the object. You'll see it's going to let me pick a wall, but I probably have to be parallel to the wall, and it doesn't let me do path reinforcement on a curved wall. But I can also come down here and use my tab key to get to the floor and choose the floor where I want to do the path. Maybe I needed to do a path reinforcement around this curve. And what the heck, we'll also do the path reinforcement around this straight part here. So one of the things you'll see when you do path reinforcement is this is not a closed loop of lines, or it doesn't have to be a closed loop of lines like we have with the 3D rebar. What this can do is just be a continuous line. And then when you do the path reinforcement, you're going to see you've got these black lines. The black lines represent the length of the bar. So if I come into the properties and say that bar only needs to be 4 feet long or only needs to be 3 feet long, you can see what's happening with this reinforcement and what's going to happen inside of there, where it's going to go. If you also don't want it to be the entire length, maybe you need to pull it back a little bit, you can do that as well. If you wanted that corner to be reinforced a little bit more, you can always pick the face of this wall and then shorten that value up just to kind of represent you're doing that in the corner. So I'll trim this corner here. So just to kind of represent, hey, I'm just going to kind of reinforce this corner coming back a little bit, etc. Okay. Same thing, you've got your primary bars. Is it going to be the path reinforcement? Is it going to be at the top of the object, the bottom of the object, if it was a wall, exterior, interior? What's the bar spacing, etc., etc.? I'm just going to say finish. And now you can see it put in all my rebar going around the curve. It also then did the rebar coming out here, as well as did some rebar overlapping in the corner. So you've got that path reinforcement if you need it. You've got the area reinforcement. Those truly are 3D tools. So if I come back to my rebar and my 3D, you can see, hey, look at that. I've got this nice, beautiful 3D tool going on inside of there. So same thing can be true for your footings, your foundations, etc. Now, one thing I want to point out, that I do have a warping slab, and I do have a sloped beam. I'm just going to come down and look at the top of this warping slab. And I am going to go do an area reinforcement in the slab. So area reinforcement, I'm going to pick this floor. I'm going to go draw a rectangle over the whole shape. Then what I'm going to do is come over to my properties over here, set up the rules I might want it to be, etc., etc. Finish this out, and it looks great in plan. But when you rotate it to 3D, it doesn't understand the warping values. So three-dimensional rebar really doesn't work when you're using sets inside of an actual object. Also, it doesn't work too well if you're trying to just place a shape. It's not going to understand that I need to follow the warping surface. I just go off of the work plane of that surface and I call it good. The same is going to be true for my beautiful column over here, that if I were just to simply go place, my stirrup inside of here, I'll use the T1 again. And I'm like, that's great. I'll go give it a layout rule. I'll tell that layout rule to be maximum spacing of 1 foot.
It's a beam, Brian.
Did I say column? Thank you for correcting me. Go back to my 3D rebar view. Oops. You can kind of see that it's not really parallel to the base. And if I were to take that and stretch it through the column, through the beam, and those medicines are killing me. It doesn't, some of it attempts to follow the slope. Some of it says, oh, I don't care, I'm going to go outside the surface. You can see the rebar shapes start doing weird, funky things. It just, again, not going to work with anything sloping or anything really doing warping. So one of the downsides, if you are doing that and you want to start getting rebar, you're going to have to start doing what's called sketched rebar, and you're going to have a whole lot of different sketched rebar on what you're doing. Or you're going to go through and manually place a piece of rebar in this object one at a time every 2 feet to get that rebar to come in and do what it needs to do. Because then you can move the rebar up or down and do it, etc. Another kind of drag thing in my mind, I'm going to kind of hide the floor and the wall here, that Revit does that can cause issues when placing reinforcing, is you're going to notice that this column over here got cut by the floor. This column over here did not. The only reason this column over here did not get cut by the floor is I truly drew a rectangle around that column, so when it cut the floor, when it cut that object. Revit does have automatic join commands where it says, hey, by the way, floors always cut columns. So if you have a floor touching a column, it's going to cut it. Not so much sense does it make here, but it makes perfect sense at the top. And I think that's what the thinking of was when the programmer set this up. Because, yeah, I don't need this column coming all the way up to the top of the floor. I want it to stop underneath the floor. So therefore, that's why the columns get cut by the floors. If you have this scenario, one option to do is to draw the rectangle around the object to cut it out. The other option, and this is completely up to you, is to go into your Modify tab and grab the Unjoin Geometry command. If I come down here and say I'm going to use the Unjoin Geometry, I can pick on that floor, and it would unjoin that floor from every single one of the columns that were in there. The drag part of that is now the floor overlaps with the column. So if I go back into my section and come back over here to the right, you can see I've got the overlapping geometry right where I'm cutting through that floor. So it's going to depend on what how you want that to look, what you want that to look like. Do I want it to cut through, not cut through? Is it going to matter when I go through and do that? That's also a way to avoid having that happen for you in the structural column schedule, the graphical column schedule. If you don't want that to be displayed, you can choose to unjoin that, and then your graphical column schedule will look a little bit better too. So just wanted to point that out when you're getting there, because in my opinion, that's definitely can be an issue when you start dealing with with floors going to slabs. So looks like we're having questions. Yeah, I was kind of expecting to have a question or two when we came through here.
A lot of very smart Revit people out there.
Or maybe I'm just not teaching them anything new.
We got one here from Charles. How would you just do a top and bottom steel bar only?
Inside of what? Top and steel bar, or do you matter? Are you thinking about a wall, column, beam, footing?
Wall.
So you would just go place a single bar up at the top, and you can do it in either direction. Again, it's going to get placed where you're at. So a lot of times I'll just go into a section because I can place it a little bit easier when I do it in a section. So if I just want to go do a rebar inside of a section, I can go grab my rebar. You can change your shape out if you want to. Just go to a 0. Am I doing it parallel to the work plane? So a lot of times in something like this, you can see it's parallel. And I try to get in here in places like, man, it's going all the way across. A lot of times I'll just come down here and throw it in at the bottom if I was doing cross dowels at the top. And then I'll just take that object and move it to the top because it's already been set up. So you can move it up, you can move it down, you can get it set, you can then stretch it to the cover distances, set it up the way it needs to be set, and it will usually adjust and do what it needs to do. So if you're trying to do it like a little horizontal dowel in that, you could also choose to change that to if you're doing some sort of like hook bar at the top. I don't know what shape that is. See, I don't know my shapes too much.
See, and what's not happening over here is your shape bar not showing up there.
Did I accidentally bump the pause? I hit the pause button. Sorry, there's a nice little control for the go-to meeting here. Thanks for letting me know that, Stan. So I was trying to find just the U-shaped bar without hooks. And I know it's in here. Oh, there it is, shape 17. So you can change that to be a shape 17. Again, you can then come back and play with the lengths of the different bars if you needed to. And you can take that and move it up to the top. So a lot of different settings and what you want to do, how you want to set that up. One thing I do want to point out, and I'll get into scheduling here in a minute, but one thing I did want to point out that becomes an issue when placing rebar. Oops, that's not one. I'm going to place some rebar in here, and I'm just going to do a rebar dowel. That you'll notice when I place this rebar inside of here, and we'll do it on the inside here, that my cover distance on this wall is set to 3 inches on the exterior, and on this wall it's set to 3 inches on the exterior. But on the walls themselves, the other faces are set to 1.5 inches. So this is where it can become a pain, that even though this wall has the correct cover distance, this rebar is going out too far. And this is a good place where that cover by face is going to be, because now I just want to grab the end of this one wall and come in here and say, gee, that should have been the same 3-inch cover distance or 1.5 inches or whatever it is. So now I can get that set up as opposed to just having the 3/4 inch cover distance. The other thing that you can do on that, I'm going to undo that for a second here, is if you really wanted that to happen, I believe doing a wall join edit will fix this as well. So if I come in here and say I'm going to edit the wall joins and pick this join connection here, I believe if you go say you want that mitered, it now might possibly pick up on it. So your wall joins will understand that if it's mitered, oh, now I need to stop at the end of the wall because that wall doesn't extend that far. So depending on your wall cleanups, if it's mitered, it might stop way short, or if it's a normal butt joint, it will determine which way that's going to go. And you'll also see if I do a next butt joint that this one got shorter and this one got long. So be careful with your wall joins as well as those cover distances of what's happening inside of there. So you can always just drag and stretch these where you want them to be to get them to the cover distance, but you might want to go in and start playing with those cover settings as you deal with them.
We've got a couple other questions here. Edwin asks if you'll discuss any scheduling in this webinar.
I will. I do have that ready to go. So.
And then Rodney is basically just telling you that's his first exposure to this, and he's going to have lots of questions in the next Revit radio, so be prepared. And then
So Jude is asking about multiplanar, so
yes.
We'll see about that.
Okay.
The one other thing I want to point out on a curved wall, and the reason I have this curved wall inside of here, is if you're like, I want to go do some straight dowels in this curved wall, so you're like, hey, great, I'm going to go do some rebar, give me take 0, you're kind of like, huh? What's going on here? The first time I did this, I'm like, oh, man, what is going on? I'm thinking I'm totally hosed. Rebar shape 9 is a curve, and it will pick up on the curve of the wall. So the first time I did this, I was kind of like, oh, duh. You go grab rebar shape 9. Now it's going to do that. You can do the same layout rules for that rebar shape. You can come in here and say, you know, maximum spacing, 2 feet, whatever you're going to do inside of here. Boom. Now I've got that rebar going up the wall. However, if I wanted to do a vertical dowel on this rebar, so I'm going to go grab my rebar shape 0. I'm going to go say place perpendicular. This is cool. All right, there's my nice rebar. Let me come in here and say I'm going to do a maximum spacing. That goes in a straight line. So if you're doing rebar on a curve like this around, unfortunately, you're going to have to place the one piece of rebar and get yourself very familiar with the array command. So there isn't around the curve a way to place rebar going up around the curve vertically. You're going to have to place one rebar and attempt to use the array command as you go around. I wanted to point that out. At least I haven't found a way to do it when it's setting up for that.
Greg asks, if I have an isolated footing with a concrete column, can I rebar the footing in column, then copy the rebar assembly to the other identical columns and footings? And if so, how is the best way to do that, group or assembly?
I personally would use an assembly just because then I can actually do a shop drawing on that, especially for what you're doing, Greg. You might want to do a shop drawing. So a lot of this stuff, I'm going to go into wireframe again here. I could grab that rebar, you know, this rebar set, this rebar set. I personally like the assembly theories on this one, so I would go create an assembly for this.
And I'm just going to let everybody know, because you made the comment, for what you're doing, Greg. Greg designs custom dairy barns and milking facilities for cattle, so a lot of that kind of work that he does.
Well, I was going to show it to you just by copying that column and footing over, but it also grabbed all the rebar in those because it should have. So let me delete the rebar out over here. So now that I've got that assembly created, I personally would come down and place that assembly into the column. So there's my one. I copied it over here. I would say, hey, I'm going to put this assembly in. I'm going to put this assembly inside this object. And that's how I would set that up. So I might have missed where the location was, but you get the gist of it. So I would use the assembly to set that information up, get it where I wanted to go. I like the assemblies for the rebars, but you could also do it as a group. It's not really going to matter which way you do it. Okay. So curves, talked about that. Boom, talked about slope. So the next thing we're going to get into is the scheduling. So I've already generated a rebar schedule. When you go into your fields for rebar schedules, there are things like schedule mark The nice thing about schedule mark, this is specific to rebar, it will put a schedule mark of all objects in the same host. So every time I put rebar in that wall, it's going to have the same schedule mark. Every time I put it in the footing, every time I put it in the column, the beam, etc., they're all going to have the exact same schedule mark. And then you've got other things like type, shape, etc. So I'm just going to go to my sorting and grouping real quick, and I'm going to sort this by its schedule mark. So now you can see here's all my rebar in shape, rebar with a schedule mark 1. Here's the sizes, here's the shape. Here's how many pieces of rebar I have, the individual bar lengths, the total bar length, and then if it's a rule with spacing, what that spacing is inside of there. You can also see I broke rebar shape 1. It's probably in my area of reinforcement. I put a whole lot of that in there, and now I've got these crazy rebar shape 1s. So you've got this nice setup inside of here. If you're not sure exactly where this stuff is, you can always click on one of these and say show, and it's going to take you to somewhere in the model where it can show you what piece of rebar that was. So that was my one little side dowel here with these 3 up here. So if you're not sure which piece of rebar you're looking at, hit the show button. It'll take you in, open up a view, and take you right to that. You could also be tiled up. I probably have more tiled than I need. So you can also tile it up, and as you'll start picking on rebar here, you can kind of start seeing it on the right-hand side, highlighting which rebar sets I'm checking on. Nice part is, if you're inside of here, you're like, oh man, I really didn't want to see, excuse me, this rebar here that maybe needed to be shape T2. As I change that shape inside of here to be the different shapes, it's updating it, which is a spiral, so it's probably going to freak it out, and a square column, but I can change that to be the right shape inside of here, and it's going to go through and update accordingly. So you do have all of that information inside of the file. Of course, now I broke my layout rule inside of the schedule. So all of that information is inside of the schedule. It's all set here, and like I said, you can change rebar sizes. Gee, it doesn't need to be number 7. It needs to be number 5. All of that information is going to start coming through. So look at the fields you have, look what's set up, and you'll also notice, like I was saying, that if I grab, oh, I made that in assembly now. Let me disassemble it. If I come in here and grab this rebar, it's got a schedule mark of 3. This has got a schedule mark of 1, because guess what? The column was the first thing I put rebar in. I think I put rebar in this over here second, so it's number 2. So it just gives you the rebar mark as you go through to set up. So that's how you can start organizing what's going on inside of here. So all those nice scenarios to set that up. It even calculates the volume for you. If you're looking about, man, I want to know how much total estimated reinforcement volume I have. Of course, this is the schedule. You could always go down here and say you want to calculate grand totals, and then you can go back to your reinforcement volume and tell Revit to calculate those totals. So at the very end, we would have 5,437 cubic feet of rebar. So it might be there to help you with, you know, how much weight of rebar I'm going to have, what's the cubic inches. You can change that to be cubic feet if you wanted to. You could change the value to be some tonnage, etc. So one of those nice little scenarios that will allow you to go through, set that rebar up, and have it do what you want to do. So the last thing I do want to talk about is multiplanar or sketch rebar. So what they've allowed us to do, and I'm going to do it in this isolated foundation, terrible example of this, but it's all I've got modeled right here. So if I wanted to come in here and do multiplanar rebar, one of the other tools you have when you say you're going to go place rebar is you now have the option up here to do what's called sketch the rebar. So when I come in here and say I'm going to sketch the rebar, it's going to ask you for the host object. And now I can come in here and start sketching a shape for what I wanted to do. You also have a checkbox up here, or I should say radio button up here, to make this rebar multiplanar or not. And what the multiplanar means is even though I'm going to come in here and just sketch this rebar from here to here and back up to here, you're going to see that I've got these little check boxes, and those little check boxes represent which direction is this going to be multiplanar. So basically, what direction is that rebar going to go away from me in? So I'm going to have this hook come down here, then you're going to see it's going to go horizontally across of it and hook down, back, and come up. So if you sketch your own rebar, you'll see it'll set this up. The other thing cool about sketching rebar is it understands what size of rebar you have and what that bend radius should be. So you don't have to calculate the bend diameter in your rebar. It goes through and sets that up automatically via the built-in rules. So once I get that set up, I'm going to say finish my sketch. In this section, all of a sudden, now you can see it's just showing me this dowel here. And the reason for the dowel is it took that and stretched it the entire length of my object and made it multiplanar. So now I come in here, here's that piece of rebar I sketched. And you can see that the rebar goes back that direction, hooks around, comes up, and there's my rebar doing multiplanar. Okay? Now another thing that I like to point out about this, besides the sketch and the multiplanar rebar, is why doesn't this look like rebar in the 3D view? I've come through here and I've set this up, and if I go to my sections, if I go to my elevations, and as long as my detail level on these are set to fine, I see the 3D rebar. Why am I not seeing that in the 3D view? Every piece of rebar or rebar set you do has what's called a view visibility state. The view visibility state has some rules set up to it. One of the rules is the object going to be viewed unobscured? What that means is, am I going to allow you to see through the object to see the rebar? The reason you see this show up in like the section automatically is if I didn't have it as unobscured in that section, the concrete would cover the rebar unless I was cutting directly through the rebar, so it may disappear. What I truly want to do in my 3D view here is say I want to view it also. I have this thing for viewing it as a solid. So if I check view this as a solid, now as long as I'm in a fine level of detail, that rebar is going to show me three-dimensionally. But notice it only did it on that one piece of rebar or rebar set that I had, the multiplanar rebar I had. If I want to do it for these other ones, I'm going to have to come back and grab this set and say view visibility state is unobscured. Now that rebar is showing three-dimensionally, etc., etc. I haven't found a global way to do this in your view, with the exception of all I do is do a giant crossing window. I come down here to say I'm looking for my structural rebar. Then with all my structural rebar selected, I can go say I want it all to be viewed as a solid in my 3D rebar view. So now when I go back down and start looking, I can see I've got the ties. They're all 3D. They even in 2013, since they can be multiplanar, don't overlap themselves. I've got all the rebar set up as 3D so I can check it out. If you are exporting out to Navisworks for clash detection and you want to show the rebar, you need to make sure your view visibility states in your rebar is set to 3D. Otherwise, in Navisworks, all you are going to get is the solid lines, not the 3D geometry. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody.
Well, Brian, we don't have any questions. If anybody has some, get them posted here so we can get them in the last couple minutes. And otherwise, we know that you have soldiered through this with a tickle in your throat, and hopefully the coughing wasn't too irritating to anybody. I know it is to Brian anyway. So.
I always try turning my head away from the microphone.
Exactly. So hopefully it wasn't too bad. But otherwise, anything else?
I think that's all we have for this. Oh, I did forget to talk about structural fabric.
Yep.
Honestly, structural fabric is not any different than area reinforcement. We'll go get out a wireframe here.
We do have a couple questions that just came in here, so great.
So if you wanted to go do structural fabric, yeah, we'll reset our hide. It's not going to be much different. So on the structure, you have the fabric command. You're going to pick the host just like you did in area reinforcement. You're going to sketch where you want it to be. And you're going to notice that once you sketch that in there, it actually does show you a rebar sheet, a reinforcement sheet. And there are rules for the reinforcement of what's the splice length. So, gee, I want these to be overlapped by 2 feet as opposed to 1 foot. Are the splices being aligned? Are the splices going to be a halfway stagger, so kind of like a brick joint? Are they going to be a partition stagger or passing stagger, excuse me? So they're staggered during the pass. A lot of different things inside of here. Is it on the external face or internal face of the wall? What type of rebar, welded mesh are you using? Are you using 6x6s, 12x12s? All those nice fun features get set up for you, and then once you say finish, it's then going to show your rebar with the laps modeled as well. So that is a nice feature to have inside of there for your mesh. You'll also see that there's your piece of fabric, there's your piece of fabric. It sees the fabric entity as a whole, or it sees each individual piece of fabric individually. So, excuse me. So you have all that information set up to go through and look at it. And you'll also see it's going to start talking about the sheet massing as well. So, sorry, I did forget about that.
And yes, Edwin, reinforcing sloping beams is just that, super tedious.
Yes, extremely tedious. I have one client where they do pretty much all slopes and warps. They don't model the rebar 3D. We've created highly complicated or highly sophisticated detail components, and they just cut them in details and do them there.
Right. And then Greg asks, how can you adjust the rebar visibility states globally?
Like I said, you can only just select it all in a view and go to the properties, but if I go add more rebar, all of a sudden it's not going to be set in the new rebar, so I'll just have to keep doing that. I have not found a way to set that up because it's per view in the properties of the rebar. I haven't found a global way to say like, hey, in this view set up three-dimensionally. That's only in the 3D views. If you go back to sections or floor plans or whatever, they just abide by the detail level. So in the section, if I go change this to be a coarse level of view, I should probably turn my fat lines back on. It's just showing you lines. If I go to your medium level of view, it does start to show you the 3D version, but it's not showing you like the stagger overlaps on multiplanar bar. The multiplanar would only show up if I go to Find. So now you can see the multiplanar stack over here.
Brian, I think that comes pretty close to answering your question. Clint asks, can you place reinforcing in masonry walls?
Yes, you can. So if I go change this wall type, since we have one here, and we'll go change this to be masonry. Okay, well, freaked out on that piece of rebar shape. I still have the available to do area, path, and fabric, but it doesn't look like it's allowing me just to do 3D rebar. So yes, you can, but not individual rebar, which I thought I could. Maybe I was incorrect in that.
We'll get with you on Revit Radio next month, Clint, on that one. And then Brian also makes the comment about the concrete volume.
Yeah, that is too, because if I look at this volume of this footing, I was showing you guys how each individual object will show you the reinforcement volume. Their host objects will show all of the reinforcement volume inside of it. However, if I go do a concrete material takeoff, it is not subtracting that volume from the concrete material. So just to be aware of that, that it does give you the estimated reinforcement volume for the concrete, but it's not subtracting that out of the physical concrete material.
We do want to let you know that this has been recorded today. We'll get it posted on the CAD-1 YouTube page here shortly, probably within the next week. And also we want to make sure that you're aware that of Brian Mackey's blog at therevitgeek.com. Is that it?
It's being, you can Google Revit Geek and you'll find it.
That's right. And then, you know, Brian is also available for helping you get stuff like this set up. So thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.